said this a few thousand times, but it doesn't, it really doesn't go without saying. This is an amazing time for me. That is, the times that we come and gather together. There's an awful lot of conversation in the world about spiritual awakening and shifts in consciousness and the suggestion that this might be a time of greater awakening for humanity rather than just for the few. I can't really say. All I know is that after 40 years in this work, the paradigm has shifted entirely for me in the way that we gather, simply because I am authentically, genuinely conscious that what really happens in these little rooms where we gather is different. It's different because we all know that we're all here sort of as the container for each other. We're not in the old model where the great spiritual guru sits at the front of the room, and even though I do speak for a little while, every time we gather, there's no sense that that's all about me. Not on my part, and I suspect not on your part any longer. We've come to the place where we recognize, I think, more and more of us, that we gather together with people that we resonate with, and if we don't, we may as well leave it alone. And if we do resonate, then what's really happening is that we're all contributing to each other. We're here to be present for each other, and you know, I might even say to make the final judgment of innocence. You know, the idea that the ego has borne for so long, and it's probably tired of carrying it, but it seems to have plenty of old muscle, that there's something wrong with somebody here, there's something wrong here, and I know it because I can see it, you know, is falling away. And given the grace of the heart, we may actually see with the eyes of the heart, I might put it that way, and recognize that the wonderment of us all, the one undivided one showing up and wearing these various faces and looking through these various eyes, seeing itself and remembering that as long as we thought things were going wrong and they needed to be fixed, or we thought we might have gone wrong and we needed to be fixed, that was the error. There's nothing wrong. It just requires a shift into a larger, more expansive, I would say hearted state of consciousness, where we really see in the way that infinite love or divine love sees. And it doesn't see any guilt. It sees innocence. So what I'm saying underneath all this is thank you for coming. I'm the recipient of this sort of redeeming possibility and potential as well. The human predicament, born into a body, personality organizes itself, limits our perception. We get conditioned, see through eyes that are usually informed by the surface mind. And as much as we may dream the dream of attack, in more subtle ways we dream a dream of control. We imagine that we have it. I have likened, I try to use metaphor because words never really get it, but they can point pretty carefully. one that I've used over and over again is that in a certain way we might begin to sense that we're waves in an infinite ocean. And I wonder how many waves imagine they're running the ocean or determining the behavior of other waves. And we've been exploring some of this stuff through the material of Brugh Joy, who I have said often used the metaphor of we're like a dinghy on the ocean. And the object is that is from the surface, from the egoic structure, and its dream of control, its power drive. I'll just ask a rhetorical question. It's not inclining toward an answer, but how many times this week have we sat and thought about something in terms of how we could best control it? One of the sort of semi-humorous ways that Brugh used to articulate that was to say again, what we're speaking of about when we speak of the egoic structure, it's simply a false sense of self that imagines itself to be alone and separate, and whatever else it imagines, but predominantly it imagines that it has control over life. So we wander through life looking at how we can best control it to serve ourselves, which of course has the subtle sense of self-centeredness trapped up in it too. It's all about me. And I don't say these things in order to be harsh, but in order that we recognize the fallibility, because the trance is pretty strong. Almost everyone on earth is trapped in it, and to step outside the trance, to live in a way where we actually realize that everything is just happening, and that in any given moment we may make choices. We do, but even those choices are determined by forces that operate way below awareness. Even our perception of what our choices are is determined by a great mystery. And I would call that mystery love, but we don't necessarily always see it as that, because sometimes it wears a harsh face. Only because that's what's needed at the time. Brugh used to say, thinking we're in control is a little bit like a quark and a photon in an atom, in a molecule, in the cell of the hair of the tail of the dog, thinking that it's wagging the dog. And all that is meant to do in a statement like that is just create an invitation, because if most of us are so conditioned to live through the surface mind and imagine that our judgments and our ability to analyze and understand how life works continues to run us, then we remain for as long as that's the case in a kind of a dream, an illusion, not just of separation, but more importantly of control and defense against perceived attacks. But there's not an attack going on. There's grace. It's all just happening. And another important, I think, pointer in that little metaphor that he expressed is a pointer or an invitation to humility. I don't think that it's possible for the ego to perceive that sort of surrendered state where we realize the ocean is determining this, or the dog in the last metaphor, it's wagging us. But it is happy. It's very relieving. If it's all just happening, and all we really have to do is make the best choice right now, isn't that a relief of a major burden? Doesn't that take a lot of the weight off? If we could relax into life and trust that we are its expression, and ultimately all it really wants to express is it wants to find, I would put it this way, it's looking for an opening through which to let the light of all redeeming love shine. We're just supposed to remember that everyone's innocent. And they're just exactly as they were created to be at this moment. Nobody went wrong. That's the dream. Actually, it's a nightmare more often than it's a dream. So, I want to talk a little bit this morning about a couple. We call this, at times, we refer to what we're doing as a mystery school. And what we really simply mean by that is that from the surface perspective, we don't know very much. Awareness is driven by conditioning most of the time, and since we're viewing life through our conditioning, we see but a tiny, limited amount of reality. We may sense, as I think we do this morning already, sort of a radiance that's all-forgiving and merciful. I mean, it's very easy to come into that vibration, especially in a group of people who all want to feel that and open to that. And they've suffered enough. You know, there's a point at which, you know, the egoic structure can bear a lot of suffering rather than let go of control. An awful lot. But when we talk about Mystery School, one of the things we're doing is not just grabbing a spiritual model and pasting it over the infinite mystery of life. We're admitting, in a way, that we largely don't know what all is living us, that we're not privy to much of it, but we're willing to become more aware of what runs us, what lives us. In some of the more simple teachings that drive toward what we might call enlightenment, you know, it becomes a matter of nothing more or less than at least in stage one, is developing what we call a witness or an observer consciousness, so that we are aware of the thoughts in our head, and we can see how many of them are driven by a self-centered need to control, or from some unconscious belief that life is against us, or that this moment is just a means to an end. But it's just the simple observation of the mind. That's a step for many of us. We get where we're willing to be And it, it requires a great humility, doesn't it, to honestly look at how our minds function from moment to moment and notice how many of our thoughts are based in a self-centered or an assumption that we know what's right and our judgments are correct. Do we all do that? Or am I the only one? No, I know you're here for me as well. I wasn't kidding about my gratitude for your presence here. So that's a step, but a deeper movement is the capacity to witness life in a kind of reverence, which is not something that the mind can do. It requires a shifting to what we call the heart, and that's just a word. Ultimately, reality is heart. In its deepest sense, reality is an expression of the grace of almost incomprehensible, I would say. It is incomprehensible to the mind, love. Anytime it touches us, what happens is our jaw drops when it really moves into awareness. Yes? Mm-hmm. So the object, as we were saying the other day, is shifting from the normal MO that most of us have been trained to operate from, which I would guess, without asking, is the mind. I trust what my mind says, and then I make my decisions based on what it says, and move forward. So there are a couple of ways we can view how the mind functions that help us become more conscious. And if we can do that from love rather than from judgment, just to become aware of this old conditioning, because it causes an enormous amount of pain and suffering. And we've been subject to it, haven't we? Mm-hmm. And what I want to talk about is the inflation of the ego, its drive to sort of reinflate itself. I don't know if most of the time we have enough appreciation for the fact that the old conditioned sense of self, even though it doesn't even exist as a real self, it is a conglomeration of thoughts and feelings that have been believed in for a long time. And simply witnessing them or having a few moments of being touched at the heart and feeling love does not dissolve the egoic structure. At least it hasn't in me. Has it you? Does it still come up and operate again? Usually just seconds after you have an expanded moment. So just becoming, in mature spiritual development, we have to not simply observe, but we have to learn how to appreciate. I would call it being a witness in reverence. So rather than make the ego wrong, viewing it from the heart and seeing what it does and understanding why it does it. First of all, it thinks of itself as real, doesn't it? Hasn't the I in you most of your life thought it was who you were? Mm-hmm. When you said I, you thought that was somebody, didn't you? Mm-hmm. Yeah, but if it isn't, just because you somehow for a moment penetrated and realized, oh, that's the separated mind functioning, doesn't mean that it just flat out never comes up again. So viewing the separated mind, there are nice little ideas about, well, I'll just choose love and I'll choose peace. Well, that's fine. That's good, but let's first observe what it is that doesn't choose peace and love, so that it can't hide out and function in subtle ways in us. And that is the tendency of the ego, to inflate itself. It's insane. And what it wants is to continue to exist and have you believe in it. It wants you to believe that when you say I, from a sense of a separated, when you say I and you mean a separated body and personality, that's who you are. It wants you to believe that. Have you noticed?
Mm-hmm.
You know, so how the ego rebuilds itself. Here we are opening up to its dissolution, I would say. If anything, the only thing that's really ever transformed, spiritually speaking, is the ego. Nothing else about us needs transforming. The whole issue is that there's this conditioning that, from a point of great appreciation, compassion, and mercy, we could see is, we came onto the earth. We must have agreed to receive this conditioning. And we did. We had parents and teachers and authority figures, and then there's collective consciousness. Isn't that wonderful? What does collective consciousness say? I'm me and you're you. And we all need to be in control. And I know what's right for me, and you know what's right for you, and there's this whole dream of separation. The subtlety that I wanted to speak to this morning is when I speak of ego inflation, I'm speaking about how that sense of separation very subtly takes on spiritual experiences, spiritual understandings, and it says, that's me. I got it now. In fact, if you watch carefully, and I don't know how carefully I was able to watch in the earliest days of playing this role, but in more recent days, as I have seen for myself, that the ego can flat out disappear for long periods of time. I've gained a great sense of appreciation for the fact that it's not something that we can expect to be gone. The announcement that I am now enlightened and living in an abiding state of enlightenment is one we might be slow to make. So inflation. There are two kinds of egoic inflation, and these are both really teachings of great mercy. If you just take a look at how your mind functions as I've described them, then you'll be able to understand it. Let's understand the first thing about the egoic structure. First, it's born in and as fear. That's what it is. The whole structure that you call me is a structure of fear. Now, if that fear-based sense of self gets its way and things go well for it, it's fairly happy, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So we don't really notice the fear. It's busy inflating right then. When really bad things happen to it, though, the ego doesn't typically surrender. It fights. And it gets to strengthen itself through the fight. But the inflation is when we think we cause something bad that happens. And let's suppose you wake up one day and I have some of these days where you wake up in a feeling of disquiet, is a word I've used lately. Mm-hmm. A subtle disquiet, where things are just like, just a little offset or something other than the feeling that everything is just one undivided, shining self with love and innocence everywhere, but a sense of, something might be not quite right feeling, just that feeling, that disquiet. And how the ego functions in order to make it conscious so we can watch it with love, because that's what dissolves it. That's the alchemy. Some of us think that, I just love everything and everybody, and that gets rid of the ego, and I can live in peace and love. But it really runs much deeper than that. There are subtle machinations that are operating somewhat unconsciously in us, and we need to be able to look at them with the eyes of mercy, not through some analytical structure, because that doesn't really help, but just to see that when something bad happens or we feel bad, we say, I did it. I caused that. There's something I've done wrong. I've misstepped. I've taken a misstep. I've made a mistake. I'm out of alignment with the truth. You feel into that? You have that kind of a subtle sense at times when things aren't going well, and maybe maybe you're not in a place where you can sit still and meditate, and you know, and just, or maybe all the meditation in the world isn't helping. Many times meditation will often just release even more of that emotional sense of disquiet, discomfort. Sometimes we don't meditate because we don't want to sit still and feel that discomfort. But what I want to point out is what its nature is up under it. At its core, it's first it's fear. If you understand the I is fear, that's what it is. If you're born into a body, and let's suppose in the beginning you know who you are. I am this one presence, but yeah, here I go into a body. I'm gonna forget who I am. You know, I mean, does that seem like a really welcome idea? To be born on Earth, where you're gonna forget, and it's gonna be a lot of times hell, hasn't it been? So, looking at that with heart and appreciating that there's fear, the whole egoic structure, the separated mind as we call it, the one that divides things up, it's insane, but in its insanity it imagines that if I can just forget who I am and take charge of this situation like they're teaching me here on Earth, I can manage my way through this. That's what it's saying. But that every time something goes wrong, at a very deep level, it validates the ego's original judgment, is that I'm separate and something's wrong with me. I've missed something somewhere. I've gone wrong. I'm out of alignment with the truth. So that's an inflation. See, the ego doesn't really care whether it feels good or bad. It just wants to feel that it is. It doesn't want to have the experience that it isn't. Dissolving isn't on it's not a part of its curriculum. If you were an ego, would you want to dissolve? Would you want to just disappear and find out that you're not? And that runs so deep because actually we still sit here this morning, and if we're really, really carefully honest, we would take an inventory and see that most of the time, and I'll model this for you, I believe that I'm this body and this personality structure, and that's who I am, and I have to look out for its well-being. And I'm my personal self, my little separated self, I'm on a spiritual path. And I plan to get awakened, and I am going to manage my way along this spiritual path. You see that? Mm-hmm. That's the cork talking. And it's going to run the dog. Mm-hmm. The object of spiritual awakening has got a curriculum built into it. The real object of it is one that the ego doesn't want anything to do with ever, ever, ever. And that is surrender and dissolution, or at least enough of it becomes dissolved so that it becomes transparent to the infinite one, the undivided reality that is actually expressing through and as the individuality. So I just thought it might be of value to take a few minutes once the heart's open and we're here for each other in the way that we are able to be here, which is we know nobody's really gone wrong. But to look at how we can get lost, because you can't just take a passing glimpse at what the mind is saying and expect that you understand what's driving it. There are forces running us that are unconscious. I used to say, back when I was doing formal ministry, I noticed my face squirmed up when I said that. It's like I might still have a judgment there. But But this is one of the things that I still recognize as true. We really don't know what's holding on and what it is down there that's grasping. It's below the level of awareness. The reason why, ultimately speaking, the reason we have grace, I'm just going to speak straight out as if I were some great authority figure. And please don't just follow the words as if they're literal. They're not really meant to be that. The reason for grace is so that we don't have to fix all the mistakes we've made in thinking. Grace in an instant opens our eyes to truth. And grace can reach into areas that we can't find and dissolve places that are still resisting. Do you have inner resistance that you can't even find? Mm-hmm. Do you have times when you just feel, but you can't see what it is? Just because you look at your surface thoughts and you can see they're running in circles, I'm irritated, I'm scared, he's wrong, they're wrong, that's wrong. You can turn around and say, well, I make a new judgment here, I see only innocence and love. And that does open us to becoming kind of a vessel, so that what we call, I've been using the term Holy Spirit again lately. It's not always a language I use, but what I mean is that the power of love working in us in ways that we can't know how to do for ourselves. That's really what I mean. It can reach those places for us. It can light them up, but it doesn't necessarily remove them for us. First, in order that we deepen our capacity for understanding and appreciation, for being able to be compassionate with others, it shows us the depth and degree of the mechanism that keeps us trapped, so that we can understand it, so that we can have compassion for it when we view others trapped in it. It's not just simply a judgment of innocence, but understanding why we're all innocent. And the reason is because nobody really knows what it is that's got them trapped in the separated mind, or what it is that's functioning when we get caught in resistance and we don't know what it is. It can look like we're trying to solve a bookkeeping problem. It's the one we had this week. It can look like anything. Typically, it looks like something that we want to be other than the way it is. And that's all it takes, isn't it? So negative inflation is really an important understanding. It opens us to kind of an amazing self-compassion. We beat ourselves up in ways we don't even see. There's something functioning in us telling us we're not okay. And it's not right there at the surface, and you're not going to slice through it with an affirmation. You can't paste an affirmation over that, and then everything's okay. You may, if you're truly open, willing, and receptive, and genuine in your invitation to the activity of love or the Holy Spirit, you may sit there and bow your head, which I've said time and again is not bowing to, some great presence in the sky with a beard, but simply the surface mind recognizing the futility of attempting to solve the problem at the level of the surface mind, which is the mind that created the problem. So it turns to something larger. I call it heart. We have it built into us. There's actually a chakra in the body that when it starts to activate, it flows into awareness, and then we see more deeply. We talked here a few weeks ago about redeeming defense mechanisms, which is, what does that mean? It simply means appreciating that the egoic structure functions the way it functions. It is defensive. It's frightened. Why wouldn't it be defensive? It's made out of fear. And if it gets defensive enough, it'll go on attack. Well, I don't want to just brush these things aside. To me, inquiring into them, looking at how they function within us is mature spiritual development. I might know 4 or 5 people who are no longer plagued with ego at all. And I don't know them personally, but I've had some conversations with a handful of them. It's a rare thing. We're not even after that. If it happens, it happens. The ego wanting enlightenment, oh God, that makes a lot of sense. Sure it does. Oh yeah.
Oxymoron.
That's one of its ultimate positive inflations, one of the ways it masks itself, telling itself that it's a spiritual self and it's on a spiritual path and it's interested in only love and only peace. No, it's not. It's interested in war and conflict and anything it can do to keep itself alive and strengthen itself, which it does by way of both negative and positive inflation. So that is to say, very gently and mercifully, let us look at the times when something's going wrong or when something's going really right, so that we're willing to become aware of how that separated mind, still that conditioned mind, still tends to function. It's naive to think it's just going to go away. And I've lived in states of expanded consciousness for months at a time, where the ego was hardly visible. It slowly was in the background, appropriating all the spiritual experiences to itself and telling itself it's now much more spiritual. That's how sneaky it is. And you can't see it, which is why it's important for us to have this sort of amazing humility. Humility only applies to the surface mind, only applies to the ego. So love says, look at the egoic structure, what it is. It's a set of conditioned thoughts that are not likely to all come apart tomorrow, no matter what your spiritual path. It can. At any moment, you might be one of those rare people who, in the likeness of an Eckhart Tolle, of course nobody wants to remember he was thinking about suicide when it happened. The ego was just fried, just burned and gone. Maybe and I had enough encounters with Eckhart to suspect that it really looks like it doesn't come back. I couldn't find any moment in which it appeared to be functioning. That might happen. But we're in mystery school. The idea here is to understand that we're not all destined for that. We're destined to be what we are and redeem that. And that's with this egoic structure still functioning, usually in part, and maybe bring its functioning into awareness so that it's not so dysfunctional. We see how we warmly, mercifully, and compassionately say, oh, I'm having a bad experience. The ego is presently, if you're having a negative experience at any time, an emotionally negative time, it's almost a certitude that the ego is feeding itself right there and then. It's busy telling itself, yes, I was right, I'm wrong, there's something wrong with me, I'm bad, I'm out of alignment with truth, something is out of order. That's what it does. It doesn't do it in a way that you get to see it very easily. It's just doing it, often below awareness. So opening up the heart to that so that you can see it, it's not true. And then I'll use the positive, and I want to point out what I mean by the grace of the heart in relationship to all this. Positive inflation is quite a bit different. Usually we don't talk about positive inflation because people are not that interested in having a black needle stuck in their happy time. But anytime good things happen, the ego is doing the same exact thing. Saying, okay, I've got it right. Anytime you watch somebody that sort of has an aha moment, the next thing you'll hear them say is, I got it. Do you? Who's got what? And who's saying that? The mind slips in and appropriates what just happened. It inflates itself. It's anything but. It's not me. It's the Father within me that doeth the work. It's not. Is that what your mind says when something good happens? Well, I didn't do that. The infinite did it. I was graced. Grace came. I was given privy to the grace of an expanded moment. Is that what the mind says? Not usually. So in mature development, where we're exploring the ego openly, bringing it right out here where we can look at it and understand it, not to give it power. We're not trying to say, okay, let's believe in the ego, it has this great power and we need to be scared of it and worried about it. No, let's just don't underestimate its shenanigans and its tactics and how subtle it is. It's way smarter than you are, because much of its functioning is not even conscious. It's taking place below the surface. So that in itself serves, in my view, to keep us humble. So when great things are happening, we might notice. Of course the ego's happy. Why, if you'd suffered all your life thinking of yourself as a poor little separate person who was bad and wrong and not good enough and not lovable, wouldn't you be ecstatic if an expanded state of consciousness visited you? I say that as if it hasn't happened to you. Haven't you been ecstatic when visited by an expanded state? Mm-hmm. Of course, it's natural. You cannot prevent a positive inflation. All we can do is be aware of it. It doesn't take away from the wonderment of it, but it adds it adds awareness to, oh, the ego is almost certain to come in here. Let me see how it functions. It's humility, is ultimately all it amounts to. We don't wake ourselves up. Grace wakes us up. Expanded states of consciousness are gifts. We can't even awaken the heart. We put our attention on it, and we open, and we allow, and we're willing. And generally it comes because we're not trying to make it happen. So, there was a statement in the decade that I spent in mystery school that I wound up having a great regard for, because awareness. Within awareness I see the value of it. And to me it's the ultimate redeeming power. All states of consciousness are equally sacred. How many people actually, does it ever occur to us that when we're trapped in resistance or resentment or reactivity, that moment comes meaningfully as a part of our sacred curriculum? But it does. It's simply an opportunity for us to see the subtleties with which the ego is functioning. All we have to do is look. But you can't look at the ego with the ego. It doesn't work. It's simply becoming aware of its functioning. To me, it's all like, a wounded knee. Every time the ego functions, it's like, oh, there it is again. It's scared, and now it wants to grab this wonderful experience and call it mine. Or it's scared and it wants to grab this negative experience and beat itself up with it so it can at least not disappear. That's how crazy it is. It just doesn't want to disappear. It doesn't want to know that it's not real. To me, that's what we mean by truth embodying itself in this world. yes, we see a different world through the heart, but this world, that's, if we're just walking around trying to point out to everybody it's all love and it's all peace and it's all blah, 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 that doesn't serve. There has to be an opening for that. But there doesn't have to be an opening for us to look at someone functioning however they're functioning through the heart and simply understand. Depth understanding, not surface understanding, not reducing what's going on to some spiritual cliche, but looking deeply into the human condition. And that's what makes us, it turns us into what we call the healing presence. We become the healing presence. I've often compared the difference between the Enlightenment traditions as they're expressed in modern day language, which I have great appreciation for, whether it's Eckhart or Aja or whatever. But both of these guys come from witnessing first. But the Christ is a different animal here, so to speak. I'm sure he loves that. but the portrayal of the Jesus Christ consciousness is the consciousness that enters all the way into the depth and the darkness of the human condition, fully into betrayal, resentment, hatred, all of that muck. And it brings the love that understands all the way into it, or we wouldn't have him hanging from a cross. Whether this is historical or literal, I could care less about that. The pointer is no less valid if we just look at the pointer, the fact that the story exists as a pointer, that it's possible to look at those that attack us and have no other real place that we come from other than forgive them, they know not what they do. Of course they don't. It's unconscious. The ego is functioning through them in a way they can't even see. So they think they're right. And that's what love does. And it does it for you. You can't see any better than you can see, can you? One moment to the next. All of this, to me, drives us to this. It's like, okay, let me see again. Let me see differently. But just saying, oh, now I see through eyes of love. I mean, that doesn't really work. That's like, again, it's a little bit like pasting an affirmation over the mystery. There's an amazing mystery going on. In its essence, it's one presence and one power and one reality, dancing as form. That's what all of it is. There's no part, you can't take one character out of the mystery play and say, well, it's all a mystery play and we're all the wonderment of the one and it's all the divine except this one. This one's evil. It's a mystery play. For there to be a play is in the field of opposites, is it not? So for there to be form, don't there need to be opposites in the world of form? Redemption doesn't come in the world of form. Redemption comes from our returning to Source and then letting Source lift or expand our awareness and allow us to see, I call it through the heart. Simply because that's my direct experience. I put out in my little email this week, most of you probably read it, that I went to a movie and it was, it's kind of a simple movie. It's one of those simple redeeming movies where, the little guy comes out on top. Anyway, I was sitting there and you never know what it's going to be if you're open. All of a sudden I feel a turning, a movement in the middle of my chest and heat. and tears start rolling down my cheeks. And in that instant, the world's redeemed. It was a complete shift.